Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead as he examined the weathered shingles on the old farmhouse roof. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. His daughter Emma played quietly in the yard below, her small hands carefully arranging wildflowers she had picked earlier. "Daddy, is it going to rain?" Emma called up to him, her voice carrying the innocent concern that only a 6-year-old could possess. "Looks like it, sweetheart," Jake replied, securing another loose shingle. "But don't worry. We'll get Mrs. Sarah's roof fixed before the storm hits." Sarah Mitchell stood on her front porch, watching Jake work with a mixture of gratitude and worry. She had been living in the modest farmhouse for 3 years now, ever since she had moved to the small town of Millbrook. To everyone in town, she was simply Sarah, the quiet woman who kept to herself and struggled to make ends meet on her part-time job at the local library. The roof had been leaking for months, and Sarah had been placing buckets around her bedroom every time it rained. When Jake had noticed the problem during one of his visits to deliver firewood, he had insisted on helping. Sarah had protested, explaining that she couldn't afford to pay him right away, but Jake had simply smiled and said that neighbors helped neighbors. Jake Coleman had been the town's go-to handyman for the past 5 years, ever since his wife had passed away from cancer. He had given up his corporate job in the city to move to Millbrook, hoping that the slower pace of life would help him and Emma heal. The work was steady, if not particularly profitable, and it kept him busy during the long, lonely evenings. "Mr. Jake," Emma said, looking up from her flowers, "why is Mrs. Sarah's house so old?" Sarah overheard the question and smiled softly. "It's been in my family for a very long time, sweetheart," she said, walking down from the porch. "My great-grandmother built it with her own hands." Jake paused in his work, looking down at the two of them. There was something about Sarah that had always intrigued him. She had an air of quiet dignity, as if she carried herself with the knowledge of something important, yet she lived so simply. Her clothes were always neat but worn, and she never seemed to have much money for anything beyond the basic necessities. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees that surrounded the property. Jake quickened his pace, knowing that the storm was approaching faster than he had anticipated. He had promised Emma they would stop by the ice cream shop after finishing the roof, but it looked like they might have to postpone that treat. "Mrs. Sarah," Emma said, tugging gently on the woman's dress, "do you get scared when it storms?" Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, her expression gentle and understanding. "Sometimes I do, little one. But you know what helps me feel better?" Emma shook her head, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I remember that storms always pass," Sarah said softly. "And usually, something beautiful comes after them." Jake couldn't help but smile as he listened to their conversation. Sarah had always been wonderful with Emma, treating her with the same patient kindness that Jake remembered from his own grandmother. It was one of the many things that had drawn him to her, though he had never found the courage to express his feelings. As a single father, Jake had learned to be cautious about letting people into their lives. Emma had already lost her mother, and he couldn't bear the thought of her experiencing another loss. But Sarah felt different. She felt safe. The first drops of rain began to fall as Jake secured the final shingle. He climbed down from the roof, his tools in hand, and surveyed his work with satisfaction. The repair should hold for years to come. "Perfect timing," he said, just as the rain began to fall more steadily. Sarah invited them inside to wait out the initial downpour. Her home was modestly furnished but filled with warmth. Books lined the walls, and handmade quilts draped over well-worn furniture. Emma immediately gravitated toward a shelf filled with children's books, many of which looked like valuable first editions. "You have so many beautiful books," Jake observed, running his fingers along the spines of what appeared to be a collection of rare volumes. Sarah's expression grew slightly guarded. "I've always been a reader," she said simply. "Books have been my companions for as long as I can remember." Jake noticed several framed photographs on the mantelpiece, showing Sarah with people in formal settings. In one, she was shaking hands with what appeared to be a government official. In another, she was cutting a ribbon at some kind of ceremony. But before he could examine them more closely, Emma called out from across the room. "Mrs. Sarah, this book has your name in it," Emma said, holding up a leather-bound volume. "It says, 'Property of Sarah Catherine Mitchell Foundation.' Sarah's face flushed slightly, and she quickly took the book from Emma's hands. "Oh, that's just something from my family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's curiosity was piqued, but he could see that Sarah was uncomfortable. He was about to change the subject when Emma, with the persistence that only children possess, continued her exploration. "Look, Daddy," she said, pointing to a certificate hanging partially hidden behind a larger frame. "It says Mrs. Sarah owns lots of land." Jake followed his daughter's gaze and felt his breath catch in his throat. The certificate was from the State Land Registry, and it clearly showed Sarah Catherine Mitchell as the owner of what appeared to be thousands of acres throughout the county. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain pattering against the windows. Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly, as if she had been carrying a heavy burden that had finally become too much to bear. "I can explain," she said softly, not meeting Jake's eyes. Jake looked at the woman he had come to care for deeply, processing what he had just learned. Sarah Mitchell, the quiet librarian who couldn't afford to pay for her roof repairs, apparently owned vast tracts of land throughout the state. "You don't owe me any explanation," Jake said gently. "But I have to admit, I'm curious." Sarah sank into her favorite armchair, her hands folded in her lap. "The family has owned land in this area for over a century," she began. "When my father passed away 5 years ago, I inherited everything. The land, the mineral rights, the timber rights, all of it. But you live like..." Jake started, then stopped himself. "Like I have nothing," Sarah finished. "I know. It's complicated, Jake. The land generates income through leases and royalties, but most of it goes into a trust that funds scholarships and community programs. I keep only what I need to live simply." Emma, sensing the serious tone of the conversation, quietly returned to her books, though Jake could tell she was listening intently. "Why keep it a secret?" Jake asked, settling into the chair across from Sarah. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the window. "Because I've learned that when people know about money, they treat you differently. They either want something from you, or they assume you think you're better than them. I came to Millbrook because I wanted to be just Sarah, not the Mitchell heiress." Jake nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on him. "That's why you were so insistent about not being able to pay for the roof repair. I could have written you a check for 10 times what the repair cost," Sarah admitted. "But I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you might think I was testing you somehow, or that I was being dishonest." The storm outside was intensifying, with thunder rumbling in the distance. Emma looked up from her book, her eyes wide with concern. "It's okay, sweetheart," Jake said, extending his arms toward her. She ran to him, and he lifted her onto his lap. "Just a little thunder." As Jake held his daughter, he thought about what Sarah had revealed. He understood her desire for a simple life, her need to be valued for who she was rather than what she owned. In many ways, it paralleled his own journey from the corporate world to the quiet life of a small-town handyman. "I'm glad you told me," Jake said finally. "And I hope you know that it doesn't change anything between us." Sarah looked up at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "It doesn't. The woman I've come to care about is the one who reads stories to Emma at the library," Jake said. "The one who brings us fresh vegetables from her garden and remembers how Emma likes her sandwiches cut into triangles. The one who worries about paying for roof repairs because she's learned to live according to her values, not her bank account." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek, and she wiped it away quickly. "I've been so afraid of losing your friendship. You and Emma have become the most important part of my life." The storm outside was beginning to pass, and rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. Emma looked up from her father's lap and smiled. "Mrs. Sarah," she said, "are you crying because you're happy or because you're sad?" Sarah laughed softly, the sound like music in the quiet room. "Happy tears, sweetheart. Definitely happy tears." Jake set Emma down and moved to the window, where he could see that the storm had indeed passed. The roof he had repaired was holding perfectly, with no signs of leaking. But more importantly, he realized that Sarah was right about storms. Something beautiful had come after this one. "Sarah," he said, turning back to face her, "would you like to have dinner with Emma and me tomorrow night? Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and meatballs. Emma's been asking if you could come over." Sarah's smile was radiant. "I would love that more than anything." As they prepared to leave, Emma ran up to Sarah and hugged her tightly. I'm glad you told us your secret, Mrs. Sarah. Daddy says secrets are heavy to carry by yourself. Sarah knelt down and hugged Emma back, her heart full. Your daddy is a very wise man, sweetheart. Outside, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Jake loaded his tools into his truck while Emma gathered the flowers she had picked earlier. Sarah stood on her porch, watching them with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. As they drove away, Jake glanced in his rearview mirror and saw Sarah waving from her porch. The old farmhouse, with its newly repaired roof, looked strong and ready to weather whatever storms might come. Emma fell asleep in her car seat, clutching her wilted flowers, and Jake drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook. He thought about second chances and the courage it took to trust someone with your whole truth. Tomorrow, he would make spaghetti and meatballs, and Sarah would come to dinner. It was a simple plan, but sometimes the most beautiful things in life were also the simplest. The storm had passed, and something wonderful had indeed come after it.